Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Maddie Reardon. I'm the Community Engagement and Outreach Manager for 88.9 Radio Milwaukee. And if you aren't familiar with who Radio Milwaukee is, we are a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station with the mission of creating a more inclusive and engaged Milwaukee through music and stories. During this pandemic, we've been able to expand our reach and to host guests from all over the world, which has been really exciting for us. In addition to our wonderful Radio Milwaukee members, we have a couple of additional supporters without whom programming and conversations like this around our podcast by Every Measure would not be possible. So I want to thank the Brico Fund, the Argosy Foundation, and the Zilber Family Foundation. And if you're interested in learning more about how to become a Radio Milwaukee member and how your membership supports programming like this, you can visit our website at radiomilwaukee.org. Our By Every Measure Ask the Experts series is just one tactic we're using to get people talking about systemic racism and how we as individuals and as organizations can use our collective power to dismantle some of these systems and to educate our networks on these topics. This particular series of conversations will happen for the next 3 weeks, so each Thursday at this same time, same place. But we've also created an opportunity for smaller conversations to happen, our By Every Measure conversation clubs. These are 6-week commitment designed to take a deep dive into each episode of our podcast, By Every Measure, with the same group of individuals so we can build rapport and trust with one another and to have open and honest conversations. These conversation clubs will start the week of February 15th, either Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. or Thursday noon to 1. You can find more information about these conversation clubs and how to secure your spot at radiomilwaukee.org or by reaching out to me directly, and you'll see my email address at the bottom of this screen in just a little bit. If you have any questions or comments, please comment on whatever platform you're streaming this on, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And with that, let's get to the reason you're all here. By Every Measure, Ask the Experts in Housing with Radio Milwaukee's Tarik Moody and Brookings' Jenny Schuetz.
Good, is it morning, afternoon? It's afternoon, right? Yeah.
Afternoon, yes.
Good afternoon, everybody who's tuning in to this special conversation with By Every Measure Ask the Experts. I want to do a quick introduction to our special guest. Jenny Schuetz is a senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. She's an expert in urban economics and housing policy, focusing particularly on housing affordability. Jenny has written extensively on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. She has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Financial Times, Economist, Vox, and Slate. Before joining Brookings, Jenny served as a principal economist in the Division of Consumer Community Affairs at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. She was also an assistant professor at the University of Southern California and a postdoctoral fellow at New York University's Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. Jenny is a non-resident senior fellow at George Washington University's Center for Washington Area Studies and teaches in Georgetown's Urban Planning Program. Jenny earned a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a BA with highest distinction in economics and political and social thought from the University of Virginia. Please welcome Jenny Schuetz. How are you doing today?
Good to be here.
Before we begin, as you know, we have this podcast called By Every Measure. We looked at different systems of systemic racism. So this week we're talking to you about housing, and next week we're talking about racial wealth gap, and realizing this conversation could be touching on the racial wealth gap. Housing plays a huge role in the racial wealth gap. Can you tell me how is housing, especially in this country, is tied to the racial wealth gap?
Absolutely. Housing is actually one of the big reasons why we have such an enormous racial wealth gap. The U.S. has relied really heavily on homeownership as a primary wealth building mechanism. So people buy a house, they pay down a mortgage over time. Hopefully the house appreciates in value, and then they build up wealth in the form of their house. When that works, it's great, but there are a couple of drawbacks to that. One is that housing prices don't always go up. As we saw in the Great Recession, there were a lot of people who bought homes in, say, 2005 or 2006 who lost wealth. But one of the bigger social issues is Homeownership only works if there aren't barriers to access, if we allow everybody access to homeownership. And historically, that just hasn't been true in the US. We have had discrimination in housing markets in a number of different places and by kind of different agents and institutions over the course of history. And so Black families in particular have really been excluded from getting their foot in the door of wealth building. So about 75, 76% of white households own their own house, and about 45% of Black households own their own house. So there's really an enormous disparity that isn't just about current income, it's about the accumulated gaps in wealth that families have built up over time.
And it's interesting because I was just on the podcast, I was thinking about my dad who purchased a home, what had childishly purchased his home back in the day. Like he couldn't get a VA loan. He's a veteran. And this is in the 70s. And luckily the developer at the time, the person who owned the house, was desperate to sell and made a deal with my dad to get his first house. And I just thought, thinking about it, on his side of the family, I think he's the only person on my side of his family. I know my mom's side, my mom has a lot of brothers and sisters, so I'm assuming like there might be people, but on his side of the family, I think he's the only one that owns a house. And luckily every time we moved, like this isn't like we moved a lot growing up, he bought a house and kind of built wealth that way. But just thinking about it now is like, he's the only one in the family that owned a house. He actually purchased before my auntie and great grandmother passed away. He bought their house for them. So it's very interesting on that. Let's talk about the policies, the racing policies that, we talked about in the 60s and 70s and 40s and 50s. Is those policies still happening? The forms of redlining and blatant policies still happening today?
There is still discrimination in housing markets. It's often more subtle than it used to be. So, technically it's illegal, for instance, for a seller not to sell a house to a Black family if they put in a bid. But it's really hard to monitor all of that. And we noticed, for instance, that when Black families were looking to buy a house, talk to a realtor, and ask to be shown homes that they might be interested in, they get steered into very different neighborhoods than white families, even people who earn roughly the same amount of money, have similar kinds of jobs. So there's a lot of this sorting that happens through real estate agents. And we've done sort of these paired audit studies to document that happens. There are still barriers to getting access to mortgage loans, and a lot of this is sort of built up in the process. So to get a mortgage loan to buy a house, you have to qualify by your income, by your job, have to have enough money saved for a down payment, and have to have a good credit score. There's a whole industry of basically predatory financial services that target Black and Latino neighborhoods, so payday lenders. If you get money from payday lenders, that's going to hurt your credit and makes it harder to save up money for a down payment. And so then that makes it harder to get your foot in the door to get a mortgage. So some of this is there is still overt discrimination, but a lot of this is just sort of systemic differences in access to credit, access to good jobs, access to wealth building. Black families are much less likely to have wealth in their families, so parents and grandparents are less able to help their kids with the down payment on a mortgage, right? And that's something that a lot of white families just take for granted. When you get ready to buy your first home, mom and dad or grandparents are going to chip in some money, but if your family doesn't have wealth, they can't do that.
And it's funny you mentioned that. Like I mentioned before, my dad actually purchased my great auntie and great grandmother, who fortunately passed away many years ago, bought their house. So it's kind of this reverse kind of thing that's happened in the Black community, because a lot of new wealth in the Black community is like young, and they're actually giving back to their elders instead of like what happens in the white communities. Also, it brought to the fact of like, I was in Minneapolis when I used to live in Minneapolis many years ago. I was thinking about buying a house, and I was talking to a real estate agent. I was like, I'm looking at a house in this area. I like this area, it's close to work. And he kept showing me houses in North Minneapolis, predominantly a Black neighborhood. And I'm like, this is not where I want to live. This is not like, and he kept doing that, kept showing houses. And I kind of like, and this is right before the housing bubble. And I kind of like, I don't want a house. And like, it just, my whole thing of like, I got to take a roof and all this stuff came into play. And he was kept forcing me to sell this. So I had experience of trying to push in the direction I didn't want to be. I just want to
and that's pretty common. I mean, we know that happens in almost every city. And some of this is just that cities are still really segregated. They're often white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods. And real estate agents steer people into that. And so that reinforces that. It should be a little bit easier now that there are things like Redfin and Zillow where people can get access to listings. So you can find a house in a neighborhood that you choose. You're not just reliant on the agent. But at some point, you're still going to probably wind up talking to an agent to get access to the home. And so there's just this opportunity for steering to happen or people to be discouraged from applying for a house in a neighborhood that they've picked.
I do have a question from one of our viewers, Brian here, asks, what is the percent of home ownership for other groups other than whites and blacks? Do you know, like Latinos, Asians?
I'd have to look up. The Asian percentage is lower actually than it is for other groups because they tend to live in California and really high cost markets. The homeownership rate for Latinos is between black and white, so it's somewhere in I believe in like the 55 to 60%.
Are there any, before I want to get to your piece about rethinking home ownership incentives to improve household financial security and shrink the racial wealth gap, which is a piece, but are there any cities, states who are like trying to address this through government actions as far as the real estate? Do you know of any policies that are trying to be in place to change the discriminatory practices?
It's a really hard thing to tackle at the local level or actually at any government level because it's very dispersed, right? So if you think about real estate transactions, it's a buyer, a seller, and a real estate agent, and you have lots and lots of all of those. And so one of the reasons why we, for enforcement, we use these paired audit studies. You send a black buyer and a white buyer who have similar kind of on paper characteristics out, is that's one of the only ways that you can sort of pinpoint this is what's going on. We haven't actually spent as much money and resources on enforcing fair housing laws. So, right, you can't test every single one of these transactions going on. You can trust a sample of them. And then if you find, say, a real estate brokerage that's consistently discriminating, you can find them and hold them responsible for it. But we haven't traditionally done enough of that to really push back on it. So that's one of the things that we're hopeful with the new Biden administration. Enforcing existing fair housing laws is a high priority for them, but that takes resources, and we're hopeful that they're going to put more money behind that.
We actually interviewed a gentleman who runs a program that does that kind of testing here in Milwaukee, where he sends two identical backgrounds, one black, one white, to see if there's discrimination as far as housing and rental here in Milwaukee. So in your report titled Rethinking Homeownership Incentives Improve Household Financial Security and Shrink the Racial Gap, you looked at going beyond just home ownership, which is interesting. You suggest a balanced set of policies that could both increase financial security and shrink the racial wealth gap. Can you talk about those policies and why do you think this, in addition to home ownership, will help?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've seen really clearly in the pandemic is that people need to have kind of a pot of emergency savings, some rainy day savings that they can tap into. And 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 expense without having to borrow. So you can imagine if you lose your job for 6 months because the economy shuts down, like you're out of money in a hurry. Homeownership, even when it works really well for long-term wealth building, isn't kind of the easiest way to keep your money as a piggy bank, right? So even if you own your home and have equity, tapping into that to pay for short-term expenses is difficult and comes with some costs. So one thing that we really need to focus on for everybody is figuring out how to encourage people to develop these rainy day savings. And one option is using kind of the mechanism of a 401k program. People can sign up for an account through their employer, they put money aside, but rather than it going into a retirement account, it goes into a short-term savings. So that's one option. There are a couple of ways that we could pretty directly address the racial wealth gap by essentially sort of setting up accounts for people that are based on your family wealth and then providing some government matches. One that's getting a lot of attention are child development accounts. This sometimes gets called baby bonds. So economists Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton have come up with this idea. And Cory Booker talked about it a lot when he was running for president. The idea is that the federal government would provide a chunk of money, say $2,000, to every kid born in the US. And that could be on a sliding scale so that families that have less money get bigger subsidies. And then this pot of money sits and grows until the kid is 18. at which point they can draw it down for things like paying for school or starting a business or a down payment on a house. This really gets around this sort of problem that generations of Black families haven't had wealth to pass on in the family, and sort of provides some seed capital that they have available. So that's a much more direct way of getting at the racial wealth gap than kind of hoping that people buy homes and then that the homes appreciate. We go ahead and give them the seed capital up front to give them something to start with.
And going through that, I realized that you know how the country seems to market itself as homeownership is one of the primary ways to build wealth. But in your piece, it seems like you feel like it is risky, especially for Black and brown people in this country. And it's actually homeownership itself has contributed to widening the racial wealth gap. Can you elaborate? You know, the whole marketing is like buy a house, buy a house, buy a house, and you're kind of going against the grain here.
Yeah, it's not that homeownership is always bad, but it's not always good. So we have tended to underplay the risk that you can lose money by buying a house. And, you know, particularly we should be sensitive to that now, because it's only 10 years, 12 years since the Great Recession, when we know for a fact that housing prices in many parts of the country dropped and people lost all of the equity that they had built up in their house. And in some parts of the country, housing prices still haven't come back to where they were before the Great Recession. So, you know, the idea that if you buy a house, it's going to hold up in value, it's going to appreciate, and you're going to build wealth is sometimes true, but not always. And we tend to downplay the risk of things not going well. Some of the reasons why Black and brown families in particular haven't done as well, they've tended to buy late in housing market cycles, right? So if you bought a house in 2000, then by 2006, you had already built up a lot of equity. But if you bought your house in 2006, right before the crash, you had a really small down payment and the value of the home dropped below the value of your mortgage very quickly. So Blacks and Latinos, because they tend to have less wealth to pay for a down payment, they're late getting into the cycle, which means they're more at risk of having these declines. They also have tended to be steered into subprime loans, which are more expensive, and so they wind up paying more for it. So it's been, for some Black and brown families, homeownership has been a good wealth building strategy, but there is a lot of risk involved, and we just haven't been very honest about that.
And on the Great Recession, were most of those houses that were basically went underwater, were they in mostly Black and brown neighborhoods?
Well, almost all of the neighborhoods had a drop in value, but Black and brown neighborhoods recovered more slowly. And there's a lot of variation in geography across this. So that's kind of the other problem with pursuing this as a national wealth building strategy. You know, if you bought a house in Palo Alto 30 years ago, then you're sitting on a couple $1 million in land. If you bought a house 30 years ago in central Cleveland or in St. Louis, or actually in a lot of small towns and rural areas across the country, housing prices haven't even kept up with inflation. And so you bought an asset that's not going to appreciate, right? There are parts of the country where population just hasn't grown, job markets haven't been that strong, and housing prices are really tied to both of those things.
So why do people I feel like, this should be like a national ad campaign from the government to tell you and I feel like it's not happening, where if you buy a house in central Cleveland or a certain neighborhood or a Black neighborhood or rural area, that your house, you're not going to have the same kind of wealth as somebody that's Palo Alto. Why is that not being communicated?
That's a really good question. And some of that is just sort of about the politics. The US government for a long time has invested in homeownership as a wealth building strategy. So, we have these government sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, whose entire purpose is to encourage people to take on mortgages. They underwrite mortgages to make it cheaper to take on this debt. So we have a whole infrastructure. We have a federal tax policy set up to give benefits to home buyers that renters don't get. So, we've constructed this whole policy infrastructure encouraging homeownership. And so the same policymakers aren't going to step back and say, actually, homeownership isn't a good idea. It's also true that there are reasons to buy a home other than expecting that it's going to increase in value and build wealth. So if you think of a place like, for instance, Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, housing prices aren't that high. They haven't grown that much. But if you buy a house, you have stability of your housing costs, right? So when you take on a 30-year mortgage, you know what your monthly housing costs are going to be for a really long time. If you're renting a house, the landlord may raise the rent at some point. And so the sort of hedge against the landlord raising the rent might be a reason to buy, even if it's not a big asset. But the thing is, if you buy your house essentially as a hedge against rent inflation, you should have something else to be building wealth, right? Don't count on that to finance your retirement. You need to consciously be doing other things. And that's really where we've fallen down on the job.
And speaking of that, is there any national effort to educate Black people, brown people about just general home ownership and these kind of things? Is there anybody out there on a national level, or is there a states doing something to be more proactive and letting people be more wise before they get into potentially a risky investment for them, or buying a house where they shouldn't be buying a house, or what they need to do?
So yeah, there are actually lots of homeownership counseling programs, lots of them run by either nonprofits or local governments to try to help people just figure out the process and what do you need to do? How do you need to build up your credit score and save for a down payment and all the rest of that? Those are still mostly run by organizations that often have an interest in people buying homes. One issue is, there are a lot of nonprofits who help people buy homes. They may be community development corporations, so they redevelop or rehab homes and sell them, and they're looking to do homeownership counseling. They're interested in preparing people to be good long-term homeowners. They provide this counseling, but they're not going to tell people don't buy a home. And so, there's a big industry that benefits off of homeownership. There isn't an industry that benefits off of telling people that they should stay renters and instead put their extra money into a 401k.
And is there anybody planning to do that? Or is there policies or even this administration or people looking at trying to do this? Or is it just so political, anti-political to talk about renting is just anti-American, as you would say? The marketing is
yeah. There's a lot more conversation now about how to make renting a better experience and more stable, which I think is sort of the flip side, right? So it's not we're saying it's a bad thing to become a homeowner, but just don't expect that to solve all your problems. I think it's actually really important that we have conversations about the eviction process and providing tenants more protection from evictions and having more transparency, with things like leases, because almost everybody is going to be a renter at some point in their life. We should make renting a good experience in and of itself so that people feel comfortable with that, and that's an okay thing to do. So it's partly, not just telling people you don't have to become a homeowner. Renting is okay. You can be a renter even for your whole life, and there's still other ways to build up assets. So I think that certainly at the moment, we're having more conversations about how to make renting better and safer and more stable. There's also more conversation about these sort of wealth building, in particular, like baby bonds until probably 3 years ago was kind of this obscure academic idea. And then Cory Booker started talking about it on the campaign trail, and it's shown up in at least some of the Biden administration proposals. So we know that this is now on the radar. That's a great idea for lots of reasons, both because it closes the racial wealth gap, but also just any family of any color that doesn't have wealth should get a little bit of seed capital, right? This enables people to go off and do things in their life, to start businesses, to invest in their communities. And that's a great thing for the country and the economy. So I think we need to sell it more on its merits.
And do you feel like what's the likely chances you think how serious this will be hit the legislation floor?
Yeah, I mean, that really comes down to whether Congress wants to set aside money for it. There are lots of people asking Congress for money for all kinds of different things. So I don't know how much of a priority this would be. It might be something that could get started as kind of a small pilot program to see how it goes for a little bit.
Okay. Let's get some questions here. How does having higher home ownership in a neighborhood affect the value? Like what happens to a neighborhood when it's like a higher percentage of home ownership?
Yeah, that sort of depends on the other circumstances. So mostly what we've observed are, for instance, neighborhoods with lots of single family homes that at some point start becoming mostly renter owned. those are usually neighborhoods where something else is going on. So, a factory has closed down or a major employer has closed down and people are losing jobs, they're leaving the neighborhood. So it's not necessarily the shift from being an owner-occupied neighborhood to renter-occupied, but that there are reasons why that's happening in the first place. We do know that there are a lot of neighborhoods that are pretty stable, that have a mix of owners and renters, usually when the neighborhood has a mix of housing structures. So if you've got some single-family homes and some townhomes and some small apartment buildings, you're going to have a mix of both owners and renters. And there are plenty of neighborhoods like that that are stable over time, where property values, basically do what they do in the larger city or the metro area. But we don't have probably enough of those neighborhoods that have diverse housing stock to have sort of enough of a test case.
I want to talk about another topic that affects housing and segregation and discrimination, gentrification. That's a big topic. It's been around. Saturday Night Live jokes about it, and mayonnaise shop in Brooklyn and all this stuff. But can we talk about how gentrification and how that affects Black home ownership? For example, in Atlanta, I'm originally from Atlanta, and predominantly it's a Black city. But the mayor recently announced last year a $4.6 million fund to help longtime homeowners in Atlanta to keep their homes amidst increasing gentrification and rising property taxes, which is also happening in Milwaukee, property taxes. So talk to me about what gentrification does. You mentioned they want to keep people in their homes, but why? What happens? You think about it, like the property goes up, but they can't stay in a home. So what happens?
Yeah, this is actually something where local governments have a bunch of policy options. When prices in a neighborhood start going up, that's good for homeowners in the sense that their asset is becoming more valuable. It's not great for renters because their rent is likely to go up, although they may appreciate some of the, like grocery stores moving into the neighborhood. But this is something where, so when property values start going up in a neighborhood, a homeowner is likely to see potentially an increase in their property taxes, but that's a choice by local governments. And actually, a lot of local governments have some sort of an exemption for homeowners, either waive some amount of property taxes initially. Lots of cities also have special programs for older homeowners. So somebody who bought when the neighborhood was cheaper may not be able to afford the higher property taxes, but usually over age 60 or 65, the city's willing to do some sort of a waiver reduction so that they don't have to pay the increased property taxes. Sometimes they can push it forwards and say, we'll let you just accumulate a balance until some point when you sell the house, so it doesn't show up on your initial thing. But I would say one flip side is we worry about the cost of homeownership for low-income households, even if property values aren't going up, just because maintenance costs can be quite high. And in places like Milwaukee or St. Louis, where there's a lot of older housing stock, there are homeowners who spend more money on maintaining their home, on the sort of maintenance costs, than they do on their mortgage. And so that's another area where local can provide just some grants, some small dollar grants, so that homeowners can keep their houses in reasonable shape.
There's a story in Milwaukee here. There's reports of some homeowners. There's one homeowner, their property taxes increased 286%.
Yeah, that's it.
And that's not, and there's one district, predominantly a Black district. Malala Coggs is the councilwoman. Like, she's got a lot of reports from her constituents about this.
That's really unusual. So most cities don't increase the property values that quickly. So the cities often only reassess the value of property, say, every 2 to 3 years. And so it doesn't go up every single year. And actually, a lot of places have either a policy or sort of an unofficial policy that they won't increase your property taxes by more than X% a year, so people don't get these spikes. One problem is for cities that have kind of older infrastructure. So for instance, like if you've got a water system or sewer system that needs major maintenance work, the city relies on property taxes to do a lot of that. So I live in Washington, D.C., and we're actually under a federal order to fix some of our water delivery systems. We had stormwater runoff. And so the city has to figure out where to come up with that. And they do that essentially by imposing not higher property taxes, but higher water fees on homeowners. The city has only so many places that it can get money from. If they're trying to deal with budget shortfalls or with some sort of big infrastructure expense, property taxes is one of the places where they come up with this. And again, that's unfortunate because the maintenance has to get done and has to get paid for somehow. Cities that have a shrinking population really have trouble with this because there are fewer and fewer people who provide the tax base for the city. And so those people have to carry a bigger and bigger load.
So that seems like that happens in Milwaukee. Like let's say you have 286 properties. I'd probably sell my house and get out of here. Like that's I would be upset, I guess. That's unfortunate.
And cities do usually have some sort of an appeal process. So
yeah,
that they've raised your property taxes and the value hasn't actually gone up, or just that you can't sell, there's usually an appeal. But a lot of people don't know that. It's not necessarily easy to figure out how to do it. Do you need a law to appeal it or some sort of evidence? But it's definitely worth asking if there's some sort of a mitigation program or some sort of an appeal.
I just want to talk about, so again, we're going to go back to this. You said the primary tool to encourage homeownership was the kind of this mortgage interest deduction, right? But you write about it in that piece I was talking about that this is not very good for first-time home buyers. Can you explain exactly even for me, like what is the mortgage interest deduction, and then why is it not good for first-time home buyers? Like they seem like they sell it as a good thing for first-time home buyers, but as according to you, it's not.
Yeah, no, this is definitely a trick of advertising. So the mortgage interest deduction, the way it works is that when you buy a house, every month you pay the bank. Some amount of that is principal, goes to pay down the debt, and some amount of that is interest. So the amount of money you pay the bank in interest, you can deduct from your federal income taxes. So, say you're paying $1,000 a month and $400 of that is interest. So every month you pay that $400, right? That comes off your income taxes at the end of the year. You pay the federal government. So in 2017, when they passed the big Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they changed the mortgage interest deduction in two ways. So one, they raised the standard deduction, right? So you only get the benefit of the mortgage interest deduction if you itemize on your taxes. So if you list out, I pay the mortgage interest deduction, I make some charitable deductions, right? So you can take these things off your taxes. But most middle income families just take the standard deduction. And in 2017, they doubled the standard deduction, right? So if you make, say, $50,000 or $60,000, you probably just take the standard deduction, which means you don't get the mortgage interest deduction at all, right? The higher your income, the more likely that you itemize and so get some benefit from this. And the way this works is the more money you spend on a mortgage, the more interest you pay, the more value there is in taking the deduction. So if you buy a house that's worth $80,000, you're probably not spending enough money on interest to make it worthwhile. If you live in California and you have $1 million house and a $750,000 mortgage, you're paying $25,000 a year in interest payments. You definitely are going to deduct that from your taxes. So the way this works is that almost all of the people who are getting any benefit from the mortgage interest deduction are high-income homeowners with expensive houses and big mortgages, and the typical homeowner doesn't get any value of this at all.
So talk about, are there any suggested proposals to change that to help first-time home buyers to get some benefits? Being a first-time home buyer?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to structure homeownership benefits around your mortgage interest deduction. We could just offer a tax credit for people the first time they buy their house. And actually, that happened in the Great Recession. The Obama administration created a first-time home buyer tax credit, which I believe was $7,000. And so when you bought a house, if you hadn't owned a house before and you bought a house, you were eligible for $7,000 in federal income tax credits, and that got paid out over a couple of years. So that's a very direct way to help only first-time home buyers. You could also make that contingent on income. So one of my colleagues, Bill Gale, has a proposal for basically getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction, right? Stop giving these giant federal tax subsidies to people who make $1 million and buy a $3 million house. Instead, let's give, say, $10,000 or $15,000 in tax credits to first-time home buyers, and you could target that at income, say people earning up to $100,000 or $120,000 a year qualify, and it sort of tails off as households make more money. That would be a much more direct subsidy, kind of the typical first-time buyer, than what we currently have.
I want to talk about affordable housing. That's been a issue across the country, like the lack of affordable housing, and where people, whether it's renting or owning, a lot of minorities, black and brown, they have jobs that pay, $7.25 an hour. Like you hear these stats where can you, what it costs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, and no one making $7.20, and there's no place you can afford a 1-bedroom apartment making $7.25 an hour. So there's a lot of conversations about affordable housing, and you did have a piece about, governments like to solve it, build public housing. But you had a piece about 4 reasons why more public housing isn't the solution when it comes to affordability. Can you talk about that? What do you mean by public housing is not necessarily a solution for affordability?
Yeah, so this is an area where it's worth kind of going through what the different ways are that we subsidize housing now. So one of the big splits is between household subsidies, so like giving a household a voucher that they can use to rent an apartment from a private landlord. And most people who get some kind of federal assistance from the government to pay for housing get a voucher. Right. We still have some remaining public housing, which was built mostly between the 40s and the 70s. We stopped building public housing after about the 70s. So there's still some that exists. There aren't that many units. It's about 1% of the overall housing stock in the country. And one of the questions now is whether we should start building new public housing. But we also build subsidized housing now, just not public housing. So there's a federal tax credit program that's the main production mechanism. And we still build what's called Section 8 project-based, so subsidized apartments that have essentially vouchers tied to the units instead of to the people who live in them. So one of the things to remember is, right, public housing that is owned by the government and built by the government is only one form of subsidy that we provide. It's a pretty small form of that. And so there are ways to provide more support to low-income households that are outside of building public housing. One of the real sort of big issues with trying to build subsidized apartments, or really any apartments, is that local zoning makes it really hard to build apartments in most parts of the country, especially in high-income neighborhoods. So local zoning often says the only thing you can build is a single-family detached house, and that's true whether the housing is owned by the government or a nonprofit agency or a private landlord and developer. So until we get rid of some of these zoning restrictions, it's going to be almost impossible to build public housing anywhere that's not already a neighborhood that has apartments in it. And so that, sort of limits the usability of this. The other thing is just that whatever pot of money we have, we should try to help as many households as possible. Building new public housing is really, really expensive. And so for the same amount of money it would cost to build one new unit of public housing, you could provide vouchers to a whole lot of households. So you would help more people in a quicker period of time for the same amount of money if we did more vouchers instead of public housing.
And I hear that conversation a lot in like community meetings, government meetings about, where there's a lot of single family homes, and people fight that for building multi. And I feel that's almost part of the whole systemic racism problem. It's not like they don't want public housing because it looks bad. They just feel like it invites a certain crowd. Am I right? Like
Yeah,
a certain element, a certain quote element. And you hear these debates in neighborhoods, which are predominantly white neighborhoods, that say that. How do we get? How do we fight this? How do we get over this? How can we change this perception, these stereotypes, to make it equitable for everyone to have good homes and good housing?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, the local zoning that bans apartments is about as close as you can get to saying that is structural racism, that is systemic racism. Mostly white affluent communities don't have to ban Black people from living there. They just make it impossible for anybody to live there unless you can afford to buy $1 million house. And effectively, that means very few Black people or very few white people can live there. So local zoning is really an obstacle. And this is a problem in the suburbs of basically every major metro area. So Milwaukee and Minneapolis and Chicago all have suburbs that are really exclusionary and that just won't build apartments. I think it's actually it's going to be really, really hard to change this just at the local level, because the incentives for mayors and city council members is to not make their voters unhappy. Their voters like these, right? There are a lot of voters who are perfectly happy with zoning the way it is. There's more, I think, more potential in changing this by moving to a higher level of government. So the state of Massachusetts actually just passed a new law that says that all of the communities that have a commuter rail station now have to have some land zoned for apartments. That's one way of the state coming in and saying, you need to change your zoning and build some apartments, especially close to transportation infrastructure. And the state has an incentive to do this because that makes the whole labor market and the region work better in a way that every local government doesn't want to do. So I think there's some interest in that, and there's actually some interest in the federal government getting involved, either using the federal fair housing law to push back on local governments that make it really hard to build apartments, or potentially tying something to transportation funding. So giving more subsidies to do light rail or even things like bus rapid transit to communities, but requiring them then also to build more multifamily housing that's close to transit.
We actually had a panel discussion with your fellow Brookings, Andre Perry, who wrote a very fantastic book about the devaluation of Black properties, which ties to the devaluation of Black lives. Like there's always this in Black neighborhoods, like again, we go back to the housing and the Great Recession, about housing values when a Black person owns it. Even in neighborhoods where real estate's assessed when Black people live in a white neighborhood, they sell it. What are do you have any ideas how to tackle that? Like, this is huge. Like, Black people who make $800,000, $200,000 lives in these neighborhoods, and their housing value is not increasing like in a white neighborhood. How do we change this? How do we systemically attack this and change and dismantle these things where the same house, the same year, whatever, is equal no matter where it is, and increases no matter where it is?
Yeah, and so I should say, Andre and I think have like different cities in our heads when we think about this. So he's from a neighborhood in Pittsburgh where it really is a problem that there are a lot of Black homeowners who haven't built wealth through their house, right? And that Black neighborhoods haven't appreciated in value. I've spent more of my life in DC and New York and Boston, where housing prices going up really quickly is the bigger problem, right? That renters who are predominantly Black and brown can't buy their first home because housing prices go up so fast, right? And renters are getting pushed out of neighborhoods. So it's which of these two you think is the bigger problem, right? Depends kind of on where you live. And in a sense, it's hard to push for policies that kind of increase real estate values without worrying about the flip side of that there's going to be some displacement and gentrification. That said, I do think that getting people to think about homeownership not as a strategy to build wealth and build your retirement wealth, but like one of a number of things you can do, but that there are other ways to be building the value of assets, right? I heard somebody on Marketplace the other day, I can't remember who was saying, like when a Black person buys a house, they may get steered into a neighborhood that's not going to appreciate, right? Or when they sell their house, they may not get as high a price for it. When a Black person buys a share of IBM stock, that's not an issue, right? Right? That's not a personal transaction. And so in some sense, getting Black and brown families to be investing their retirement wealth, their long-term wealth in things other than real estate is a way to get around this problem, right? If I had a magic wand that I could wave to end racism in people's hearts, that we would use it, but it's not that easy with policy tools to do that. And so some of the policy tools we have are just, hey, there are other ways for people to build wealth that aren't as subject to kind of personal decisions and to racism.
And are there any cities, counties, districts in the country doing innovative things to change this that you know of that Milwaukee can learn from? Like anything we talked about, is there a mayor somewhere going, let's try something different?
So there definitely are some mayors that are pushing back on kind of the racist zoning, trying to make trying to make it easier to have a diverse housing stock in every neighborhood in the city. Actually, yesterday got totally drowned out with the election news, but the city of Sacramento, California, just made it legal to build 4-unit buildings in all of their neighborhoods. So any place you can have a single family house, you can also have a fourplex, right? That makes it a lot easier to just have diverse housing stock, to have renters and owners living in the same neighborhoods, and to increase the housing stock. And that's a great thing to do, right? And cities could do that tomorrow if they wanted to. Minneapolis has done something like that. So there's definitely some work going on there. Other cities really have tried to tailor their housing response to their problems. Like Philadelphia has a big problem with older housing, lots of older homeowners where the house is depreciating because the house is old and it has maintenance problems. So they've created a small dollar grant program where homeowners can get money, up to, I think, $5,000, so they can fix the roof, they can buy themselves a heating system, right? Physically maintaining the property is a good way to keep the value from falling further and to keep people in their homes, right? And that's an issue that a lot of cities with older housing stock could do. They haven't done it as much before, and some federal money to help there would be really useful.
And most people don't realize, people might think that, well, you're just helping people out, but like this helps the overall neighborhood to attract more people, but also helps the overall city. This is not this is a win-win for everybody. I think most people just think it's like, hand me, give me, but it's really the city's investing in the city overall.
Absolutely.
Are you familiar with Marisha Bharadhan, the author of
Oh, yeah.
I was reading her book. She was talking about the Homestead Act and how that played a huge role in this wealth disparities. Do you understand how that happened and why that is?
So I don't know the older history of that. There's some proposals to do a newer version, which is basically for cities to give people.
Yes, she wrote something called 25th Century Homestead Act.
Yeah. And actually, Pete Buttigieg had this in his platform when he was running for mayor. There's some cities that have pretty large inventories of properties. So places that have had, for instance, a lot of tax foreclosures. The city owns a bunch of houses. Mm-hmm. The city doesn't need to sit around on vacant houses and maintain them. There are people who need homes. And so they could essentially give or sell at a very low price these homes to renters who want to own their own home. I will say, I think we should be a little bit careful about encouraging people to buy their first home in a neighborhood that has a lot of vacant properties. That may or may not be a neighborhood that is on an upward trajectory. So I think having some low-cost loans to help people into homeownership, but we should also let them pick the neighborhood they want to move into, right? And letting people buy vacant homes that have gone through tax foreclosure, there's also some danger that the homes are in not great shape and they're going to take money to maintain, right? So I think we also downplay to people how expensive it is in time and money to be a homeowner. Even if you buy a home that's in pretty good shape, stuff breaks, stuff needs to be replaced, stuff gets old, and you can spend a lot of money fixing up a house after you moved in, after you've made the down payment. That's not everybody's cup of tea. Not everybody wants to be, going to Home Depot doing home repair. And so we should just make sure that people understand what they're getting themselves into. And it's okay not to want to own a home because you don't want to spend your weekend doing maintenance projects. It's okay to be a renter and have a landlord do that for you.
I feel like, I don't know, it's kind of like how society pressures people to get married and have kids. I don't feel like I've directly been pressured to buy a house, but I feel like the advertising, the marketing is like, what's wrong with you? Why are you renting? You're throwing your money away. And I'm just feeling bad about myself, and I'm like, I don't want to worry about a freaking water heater. I don't want to deal with this stuff. But
and you know what, the first couple of years that you buy a house, you're not building that much equity. You're basically paying interest to the bank. So whether you're paying rent to a landlord or interest to the bank, that's money that's going out of your pockets either way.
Yeah. And it's funny, I was looking at you remember the time when like they called it ruin porn Detroit. So Zillow was like, I was on Zillow or some other sites before Zillow, was looking at these houses in Detroit and going like, wow, this mansion's $500. This place is $1,000. And then you think about it, it's like, well, what's wrong with this place? Why is it $1,000? Is it because it's Detroit at the time, or is it really there's something really structurally wrong with this house. So it's just, I was just thinking about that, and like you see these things and like, wow, $500, I have $500, I'm gonna buy this house, and then realize the property tax is more than the house you paid for, and all this other stuff you gotta like. So it's really about educating and getting the right tools to people. And the problem, I feel like the education of house ownership is siloed in certain ways. It's not a comprehensive education of everything like these programs don't do. But someone
and I think we've also we have to give people also a positive vision to strive for. That's not the 1950s. Everybody has to have a single family house, with a white picket fence in the suburbs, and drive their car to work. Like that's still very much the model of that. That's being a grown up. That's right, having made it. That's having achieved the American dream. If for no other reason than climate change, we need to have a different vision of what the American dream looks like, right? So a lot of younger households now who are currently renters can't afford to buy a single family house in a neighborhood that's close to where they work, right? They'd be way out in the exurbs and then have these long commutes. We need to have a vision for an adult life that's not being a homeowner of a single family house out in the suburbs, right? And realistically, that's an expensive lifestyle in a lot of ways. It's not a lifestyle that everybody wants. Lots of people would rather be in a neighborhood that has things you can walk to, that's closer to downtown. That needs to be okay, right? But we haven't, I think, made a strong enough case for a new version of the American dream that might be being a renter in a high-rise apartment building, but close to a park and close to lots of restaurants and close to all of your friends. That needs to be an okay version of adulthood.
And finally, I want to ask you kind of a final question about the new administration. So if there's one thing you want to propose to administration when it comes to one, closing the homeownership group blacks, or building wealth, what one policy would you want the administration to focus on and work on?
I mean, I think there are two policies, because we've got to think about sort of people at different points in the income distribution. So we absolutely need to provide more financial support for low-income renters. I mean, we have just abandoned them. Only 1 in 4 low-income renters gets any kind of financial assistance. People are really living on the financial edge, and there's no way that they can achieve financial stability. So providing more subsidies to households is really essential. For middle and higher income households, some combination of wealth building that's not tied to home ownership, whether that's baby bonds or individual development accounts or mixture of those things, is really essential, right? So this just enables families to have some financial stability and security without being dependent on the real estate market.
And finally, there's a amazing woman who's actually on our board here. The station, Julie Kaufman, runs a place called Fixed Development, where she does community investment in commercial properties, and especially in communities of color. Like there's a restaurant called the Tandem. There's a place called the Sherman Phoenix, which is kind of a collective of Black businesses. She has a different model of real estate, and I'm really interested in that. Have you heard of models like this where she gets the community involved in investing in the community? In real estate, commercial real estate. Do you have any thoughts or concepts of that kind of investing in that kind of real estate as far as wealth building?
Yeah, I haven't heard as much about it, but there's no reason that the same sort of model towards business ownership shouldn't apply too. And in particular, I think there's some value to, neighborhood serving businesses. People who live in the neighborhood benefit from having them there. This is a really tough time for small businesses, and especially for things like restaurants. So, having some communities band together and, create mutual aid societies or sort of lending circles to provide financial support to businesses could be something that's worth looking at.
Cool. I think that's all I have. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. We had some comments about, Christy mentioned there's an organization, Locally Take Root Milwaukee, is a group that promotes homeownership resources, HUD approved counseling agencies, community-based groups, neighborhoods. Katie has a nice comment: as a renter in my 40s, same as me, I feel so much better. Did I say I'm 40? I think I'm 20. Sorry. I love the idea of being more imaginative and resourceful about building wealth in ways than the property ownership. Like I have, thanks to my dad, just because of him, like I have a Roth account now. Like we started 7 years ago, and he kind of matched it a little bit, and it takes a little bit of money out, not that much, that I even notice, in a Roth account, which now it's 5 years in, I can actually take that out without any penalties to like put in a house or put in a business now. And we've been playing with stocks, and I'm looking at commercial real estate. And so I'm appreciative of my dad that he really taught me based off his experiences going through the racism and when he dealt with that. He's learned a lot and he's trying to pass it on to me. Sometimes I'm a little stubborn, but I think the older I got, I'm like more willing to listen to him. But just some things I've learned, that I don't have a house, but I do have now, not only 401k, I have a Roth, I have stocks, I don't have a home, so thank you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us about, systemic racism, housing, and just, some of the issues that affect home ownership and renting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's also really important that we talk about this in the context of specific cities, because what makes sense in one city doesn't work in another place. And, a lot of the homeownership conversation, I think, gets pushed by people who live on the coast where housing prices go up and up and up. And it's not obvious that in, places like Milwaukee or Cleveland or St. Louis, that it's necessarily going to be the same return.
Just want to again say a huge thank you to Jenny and Tarik for this extremely important conversation. I learned so much in this past 56 minutes, and I too feel better about being a renter in my 30s. Thank you all for tuning in to this live stream, and remember to join us next week at the same time, same place, for the third conversation in our By Every Measure Ask the Experts series, centered around systemic racism in the creation of the racial wealth gap. So kind of a continuation of this conversation with Omar Ocampo from inequality.org. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Tarik. We appreciate you so much. And we look forward to continuing this conversation next week.
Thank you.